His father pressed his palm flat against the inside of the root cellar wall and held it there. Outside, ice crystals drove sideways through the farmyard. Inside, the lamp barely flickered. The wall was cool, not cold. His father stuffed a wad of moss into a crack near the hinge and said that wind finds the pore first, but the ground remembers warmth. He was 8 years old. He filed the lesson away the way children file things, without knowing what it would cost to remember. Now he stood in a Nebraska creek bed with coins in his pocket and no roof over his head, and winter was 12 weeks away. September of 1887 had already turned cold the night Tolef Brecka climbed down from the work train for the last time. The paymaster counted $11.40 into his palm, and the coins felt lighter than they should have for 4 months of driving spikes and pulling ties. His left knee had swollen to the size of a turnip after a derailment cleanup south of Broken Bow, and the section boss told him plainly, a man who could not keep pace on the tie gang was a man the railroad could not feed. Tolef stood on the gravel grade in a patched wool coat with a tin stove lid under one arm and nothing else that mattered. $11.40. No claim deed, no team, no lumber, no relatives within 1,000 miles. Winter would come in 12 weeks, and in central Nebraska in 1887, winter did not negotiate. He could not go east. A fare to Omaha cost more than he carried, and Omaha had no use for a limping Norwegian with no English beyond what the railroad required. He could not go west. The line crews were already consolidating for winter, and the next section camp had its own surplus men. He could not stay at the depot. The station master had already made that clear by locking the freight room door while Tolef watched. So he stood on the grade with sleet beginning to tick against the stove lid, and he looked down the ravine. The boxcar sat canted against a stand of cottonwood roots where a spring flood had shoved it off a siding 2 years earlier. 34 feet of warped oak planking, 9 feet wide, listing to the south where the undercarriage had snapped. The roof was split along one seam. The sliding door hung open on a bent track. The railroad had stripped what they wanted, the trucks, the couplers, the brake rigging, and left the shell to rot because hauling it out cost more than it was worth. Tolef had passed it every morning for 4 months. He had never looked at it as anything but wreckage. Now he looked at it the way a man with no shelter looks at 4 walls and a roof. The first night, he slept under the canted end of the car with his coat pulled over his face and the stove lid propped against the wind. He woke before dawn with frost on his collar, and his knee locked so tight he had to straighten the leg with both hands before he could stand. The creek bed was dry. The air pooled in the draw like water in a trough, cold, still, heavy. Above the banks, wind stripped the grass flat. Down here, the grass barely moved. He noticed that. He noticed it the way his father had taught him to notice things back in the valley south of Bergen, before the family broke apart and the boys scattered to different ships. His father had built a root cellar into the side of a hill, and one winter when Tolef was 8, his father had pressed his palm flat against the inside wall and held it there. The wall was cool, not cold. Outside, the wind drove ice crystals sideways through the farmyard. Inside, the lamp barely flickered. His father had said something Tolef remembered now, standing in a Nebraska creek bed with $11 and no roof. Wind finds the poor first, but the ground remembers warmth. His father had not been a philosopher. He had been a man who sealed cracks with moss because he could not afford boards. Tolef climbed the bank and walked into Broken Bow. The town was 4 years old and already overpromising. The Burlington and Missouri River Railroad had reached it in 1886, and the storefronts on the square looked permanent from the front and temporary from the back. Tolef went to the livery and asked for day work. The owner, a heavy man with ink stains on his cuffs, said he could feed Tolliff dinner but had no beds and no wages for a man who could not shoe a horse standing up. Tolliff ate the dinner and did not argue. He went to the lumber yard. Scrap pine, the cheapest grade, cost more per board foot than he could stretch across a cabin frame. He asked about salvage, damaged planks, broken pallets, anything a man could drag away for next to nothing. The clerk shook his head. A man named Prairie had already claimed the railroad's discarded materials. Everything from the derailment site, scrap iron, usable planks, hardware, strap hinges, belonged to Prior's account, signed and filed. Tolliff asked who Prairie was. The clerk looked at him the way clerks look at men who do not yet understand how things work. Edwin Prairie buys what the railroad does not want, the clerk said. Then he sells it to the people who need it. Tolliff walked back to the ravine. He considered a dugout. The draw walls were steep enough in places, and he had seen dugouts along the line, holes cut into hillsides, roofed with poles and sod, dark as coal bins and damp as wells. But where the draw walls looked solid, the soil was sandy clay that crumbled when he pushed a stick into it. Where the clay held firm, the walls were too low to stand inside. A dugout needed a breaking plow to cut the sod roof, a team to haul the ridgepole, and weeks of labor he did not have. He had 12 weeks, less if October came hard. He considered a sod house. Settlers across Nebraska built them, dense root prairie grass cut into strips, trimmed into bricks roughly 12 inches wide and 4 inches thick, then stacked into walls 2 feet deep. A proper soddy could hold a family through a plains winter, but cutting sod by hand spade without a plow or team would take a strong man 6 weeks for the walls alone. Tolliff's knee would not give him 6 weeks of kneeling and lifting. He did the math on the walk back and stopped doing the math because the answer was the same every time. He stood at the lip of the ravine and looked at the boxcar again. 4 walls, a roof damaged but present, a floor buckled but solid enough to stand on. 34 feet by 9 feet of enclosed space that a team of railroad carpenters had already built, already sited, already roofed. The railroad had spent more money building that car than Tolliff would earn in 3 years. And it was sitting in a creek bed, listing against cottonwood roots, with its door open to the wind like a mouth waiting to speak. The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived the way water finds a channel, first as a trickle, then as a thing that would not stop. What if the creek bed was not the problem? What if the creek bed was the foundation? The draw walls blocked the wind. The earth held warmth. The boxcar was already a shell. Walls, roof, floor. If he could move it into the narrowest bend of the draw, wedge it between the banks, and pack the gaps with sod and river clay, the earth itself would become the insulation. The wind would pass over. The cold would press against 2 feet of packed soil instead of bare pine. He would not need 6 cords of firewood because he would not be heating the sky. He would be heating a sealed box buried in the ground, his father's root cellar. Except the root cellar had been dug into a hill, and this would be a hill packed around a room. The idea was simple. The execution was impossible. The boxcar weighed somewhere near 20,000 pounds. Tolliff weighed 160 with a bad knee. He had no team, no winch, no chain, and no one in Custer County who owed him a favor. He lowered himself into the draw, favoring his right leg, and pressed his palm against the boxcar wall the way his father had pressed his palm against the root cellar. The wood was cold, but it was already a wall. He said nothing. There was no one to hear. 3 days later, Anson Vail came. Vail was 58 years old, a former Army wagon boss, and the county-appointed road viewer for the western half of Custer County. His job was to inspect roads, drainage courses, and public ways, and the dry draw where the boxcar sat ran under a county bridge a quarter mile downstream. If a man obstructed the draw, Vale had authority to remove the obstruction. He rode a bay horse with a limp that matched Tolof's, and he carried a hickory cane that he used for pointing at things that disappointed him. He pointed at the boxcar. "You are living in this," Vale said. It was not a question. Tolof was sorting bent spikes by length, the ones he had pulled from the abandoned section camp. He had 63 spikes in 4 piles, nails too short for framing, nails long enough for bracing, nails bent beyond use, and nails that might hold a hinge. He did not stop sorting. Vale dismounted slowly, walked the perimeter of the car, and tapped his cane against the south wall where the planking had split. He crouched, his knees cracking louder than Tolof's, and looked under the frame where the undercarriage had sheared away. Then he stood and looked up at the draw walls, the cottonwood stand, and the bare sky above. "No timber within dragging distance," Vale said. "No stacked hay, no chinked walls, no team, no stove." He tapped the tin stove lid leaning against the car. "You have this, and 60 bent nails." 63, Tolof said. Vale did not smile. "You need 6 cords of firewood before hard frost. You need walls that do not pass wind. You need a roof that holds snow weight without folding. You need a stovepipe, and a floor that does not freeze your feet to the planking." He planted his cane in the creek gravel. "What you have is a wrecked rail car and a notion." "The car has walls," Tolof said. "The car has holes," Vale said. "And the car is in a creek bed, which means spring runoff will fill it like a stock tank. And the car has no stove collar, no insulation, and no draft control, which means if you seal it and light a fire, you will either smoke yourself blind or suffocate before Christmas." He pulled his cane from the gravel. "I have seen men die in better shelters than this, Brecca. A winter dwelling must be above grade, visible, ventilated, and built on dry ground. This is none of those things. This is a coffin with a door." The phrase settled into the air between them like a dropped tool. Tolof picked up another bent spike and tested it against the ball of his thumb. "A coffin does not have a floor you can stand on," he said. Vale mounted his horse. "I will check this draw again before snow. If you're still alive, I will be surprised. If you have obstructed the drainage course, I will remove you." He turned the bay horse toward the bridge road. "Get out of the creek bed, Brecca. Build a proper soddy or go to town and sleep in the livery. Do not die in a ditch because you were too stubborn to ask for a bed." Tolof watched him ride until the horse crested the bank. Then he went back to sorting spikes. The idea had one requirement that Tolof could not solve alone. The boxcar had to move. Not far. The draw curved 200 yards upstream, narrowing from 12 feet across to roughly 10, where the bank steepened and the clay turned dense. If he could drag the car sideways into that bend, the bank walls would brace both sides. He could pack the remaining gaps with sod and clay. The banks would become insulation and windbreak simultaneously. The narrow point would hold the car like a fist. But the car weighed 20,000 pounds and would not slide on creek gravel without rollers, skids, and something stronger than a man with a rope. Tolof needed oxen. The only oxen for hire belonged to Lute Harwick. Lute was 42, a farmer with a half-finished soddy, 2 oxen he had driven from Missouri, a wife who did not like visitors, and a face that looked like it had been assembled from leftover parts. He was not unfriendly. He was practical in the way that men who have almost lost everything become practical. Every decision was measured against what it might cost. Tolof found him mending a doubletree in his yard. "I need your team for 1 day," Tolof said. "I can pay $2. Lute looked up from the doubletree. "For what?" "Dragging a boxcar into the draw bend." Lute set down his tools. He did not laugh exactly, but something moved across his face that was close. The wrecked Burlington car. Yes. That car weighs more than my barn, Brecky. If it shifts wrong on those rollers, it will snap the tongue and take the team down with it. If the bank gives while you are under it, you will be digging yourself out with broken legs. He picked up the DoubleTree again. And if Pryor hears you are improving his salvage claim, he will have you removed before the mud dries. The car is not on Pryor's claim, Tolliff said. It is in a drainage course. Vale already told me it is an obstruction. Then Vale should be glad you are moving it. Vale thinks I should leave it and build a soddy. Vale is not wrong. Lute tested the DoubleTree's splice. I've watched men try to move things that did not want to move. The thing always wins. That car has been sitting in that creek bed for 2 years. The gravel has packed around the frame. The cottonwood roots have grown into the undercarriage. You would need 4 oxen, a windlass, and a week of clearing before the first pull. I have a wagon axle for the windlass, Tolliff said, and I've cleared the roots. Lute looked at him. When? 3 days. Lute set down the DoubleTree again, slower this time. He walked to where Tolliff stood and looked at his hands. The palms were torn open from grubbing cottonwood roots with a salvaged hatchet. 2 fingernails were black. The knee was wrapped in a strip of flour sacking stained dark with something that was not flour. You cut those roots by hand, Lute said. I did not have an axe. Lute was quiet for a while. Then he said, I will not lend the team. If the car shifts and kills one of my oxen, I cannot replace it before spring. I am sorry. Tolliff nodded. He had expected this. He turned to leave. But ask Ragna Moen, Lute said. She knows that draw better than anyone. If she says the bank will hold, I might think about it. Tolliff had not heard the name before. He asked at the store who Ragna Moen was, and the storekeeper told him without enthusiasm, a Norwegian widow, 61, who had lived near the draw for 9 years, who had built her own soddy after her husband died of pneumonia, who served as a midwife when no doctor was available, and who knew more about sod, clay, and drainage than men who charged money for the knowledge. The storekeeper also said she was difficult, which Tolliff understood to mean that she did not agree with people simply because they expected her to. He found her house a mile east of the draw, a squat, thick-walled soddy with a chimney that drew straight and a dooryard swept clean of everything except a chopping block and a rain barrel. Ragna was standing beside the barrel, pouring water through a cloth filter into a jug, and she did not look up when Tolliff approached. I need someone to tell me if the bank at the draw bend will hold a boxcar's weight, Tolliff said. Ragna finished pouring. She set the jug down, folded the cloth, and then looked at him. She had a face like a winter creek. Sharp lines, no softness wasted, eyes that had stopped being surprised a long time ago. Which bend? She said. The narrow one, 200 yards upstream from the cottonwood stand. The one where the clay turns from gray to brown. Yes. She studied his hands the same way Lute had. Then she looked at his knee. Then she said, Come back tomorrow. I will look at the bank, but I will not lie to you about what it can hold, and I will not help you die in a creek bed because you are too proud to sleep in a haystack. I am not proud, Tolliff said. I am out of choices. Ragna picked up the jug. Those are often the same thing, she said, and went inside. She came the next morning before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Tolliff was already in the draw, and he watched her descend the bank with the careful steps of someone who had learned where clay held and where it gave. She did not speak. She walked the length of the boxcar, touching the planking, pressing the seams, running her hand along the split roof board. Then she walked upstream to the narrow bend and crouched beside the bank wall. She rubbed clay between her thumb and forefinger. She smelled it. She scraped deeper with her thumbnail and rubbed again. She stood, walked to the opposite bank, and did the same thing. Then she looked at the gap between the banks, roughly 10 feet, and at the boxcar sitting 200 yards downstream. "This part will hold," she said, pressing the east bank. "The clay is dense and the roots go deep. 3 feet down, it will not shift." Then she crossed to the west bank and pressed again. "This part will drown you. The clay is thin over sand. Spring melt will push through here like water through a sieve. If you pack a car against this wall, the first warm rain will wash the seal out and fill your room from the side." Tola felt the idea contract. "Both banks have to hold." "Both banks have to hold," Ragna said, "and this one will not. Not here." She walked 10 paces upstream, crouched again, and dug into the bank with her fingers. The clay came out darker, stiffer. She broke it open in her palm. The inside shone slick where it fractured. "Here," she said. "The clay changes here. This will seal. This will hold weight. But you lose 4 feet of width. The banks are closer. Your car may not fit." Tollef measured with his frayed rope, walking the gap 3 times. 9 feet 4 inches at the narrowest point. The boxcar was 9 feet wide. 4 inches of clearance on one side. Nothing on the other. "It fits," he said. "Barely." Ragna stood and brushed clay from her hands. "If you are off by 2 inches, you will jam it sideways and never move it again. If you are off by 4 inches, it will wedge and split the planking." She looked at him with those Winter Creek eyes. "This is not a thing to do almost right." "Can the drainage be managed?" Tollef asked. "If the car is in the right position?" Ragna looked upstream. She pointed at a low spot in the east bank where water had clearly overflowed in past springs. "You cut a diversion trench above the car. Not deep, 18 inches, angled to carry runoff around the mound, not into it. And you slope the floor of the draw upstream of the car so water moves away before it reaches the walls." She said it the way she might describe how to set a broken bone, precisely, without drama, as if the knowledge existed whether or not anyone was smart enough to use it. "Will you show me where to cut it?" Tollef asked. Ragna was quiet. She looked at the boxcar, then at the narrow bend, then at Tollef's wrapped knee and his torn hands. "I will mark the cut," she said. "I will not dig it for you, and I will not tell Lute Harwick his oxen are safe until I have watched you prepare the roller path and seen the skid logs set. If the path is wrong, the car will roll off the logs and pin you in the creek bed, and I will not be responsible for that." "I am not asking you to be responsible." "You're asking me to say the bank will hold. That makes me responsible whether I want to be or not." She started climbing the draw wall. "Cut the roller path first. Peel 8 cottonwood logs, each at least 6 inches through. Grease them with tallow if you have it. Axle grease if you do not. Set them across the creek bed 2 feet apart and stake them so they cannot kick sideways under load. When you have done that, send word and I will come look." She reached the top of the bank and turned back. "And dig a test hole beside the west bank where I marked. Wait overnight. If no water seeps in by morning, the seal will hold. If it seeps, do not build there." Tollef dug the test hole that afternoon. He dug it 18 inches deep with the salvaged hatchet and a flat stone, scraping clay and gravel until the hole was clean enough to show water, if any came. Then he set a white chip of cottonwood bark at the bottom so he could see the color of any seep. He barely slept. When he crawled to the hole before dawn, the bark chip was dry. The clay had held. That day, Edwin Pryor came to the draw. Pryor was 49, narrow-shouldered, and dressed better than anyone in Broken Bow needed to be. He had arrived with the railroad in 1886 and had positioned himself between the company and the settlers the way a toll bridge positions itself between two banks of a river. He bought surplus. He bought salvage. He bought the things desperate people could not afford to keep and sold them back at the price the market would bear. He was not illegal. He was simply the kind of man who understood that scarcity was worth more than abundance. He brought 2 men and a wagon. Tolliff was on his knees in the creek bed, driving stakes into the gravel to anchor the first skid log. Mud caked his forearms to the elbows. His knee throbbed with every hammer blow from the hatchet back. Pryor stood at the lip of the draw and looked down. "Brecka," he said, "I understand you intend to occupy the Burlington wreck." Tolliff drove another stake. "I intend to keep snow out of my lungs." "That wreck is salvage property. The iron straps, the hardware, the hinges, the usable planking. I have a signed account with the railroad for everything at the derailment site." Pryor produced a folded paper from his coat. "Including the shell." "The shell has been in this creek bed for 2 years, Tolliff said. "The railroad left it because it costs more to remove than it is worth." "What the railroad leaves and what the railroad sells are different things." Pryor descended the bank carefully, keeping his boots out of the mud. His 2 men stayed with the wagon. "I am telling you plainly, Brecka, you are improving stolen wreckage. If you seal this car, if you cut into the walls, if you add a stove collar, you are modifying property that belongs to my account." Tolliff stopped hammering. He looked at Pryor. "Then remove it." Pryor blinked. "What?" "If it is your property, remove it. Bring a team, drag it out of the creek bed, haul it to your lot in town. I will stand here and watch." Pryor did not answer immediately. The offer exposed the truth that both men understood. The car was worth more as salvage parts than as a whole shell, but disassembling it in the creek bed would cost more in labor than the parts were worth. Pryor wanted the iron and the planking, but he did not want to pay men to strip it on site. What Pryor actually wanted was for Tolliff to improve the car, and then for Pryor to claim the improvements. Pryor stepped forward and kicked one of Tolliff's anchor stakes loose from the gravel. The skid log shifted. 2 hours of alignment work moved 3 inches sideways. "I have filed a salvage notice with the county clerk," Pryor said. "You have 10 days to remove yourself and any occupation from this site. After 10 days, I will send men to strip the car, and anything you have added to it becomes part of my claim." He folded the paper back into his coat. "You are building on borrowed property with borrowed time, Brecka. A man who sleeps in a rail car underground saves the county the price of burying him." He climbed the bank without looking back. The wagon creaked away toward town. Tolliff knelt in the creek bed and looked at the shifted skid log. 2 hours of work. He reset the stake, drove it deeper, and kept working. On the ridge above the draw, Anson Vale sat on his bay horse and watched. He had seen the entire exchange. He did not ride down. He did not intervene. The law might be on Pryor's side, and Vale had no interest in standing between a land speculator and a homeless man over a wrecked rail car that nobody had wanted until someone tried to use it. The wind picked up. Tolliff's hands bled through the flour, sacking he had wrapped around his palms. He had 8 cottonwood logs to peel, a roller path to grade, and 10 days before Pryor could legally strip everything he built. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Tolliff has not proven anything yet. The town calls it a wooden grave. Pryor wants to take it. Vale expects to find a body. But Tolliff is still in the creek bed driving stakes. The next morning, he began peeling logs. Cottonwood was not good timber. It was soft. It split along the grain, and it warped when it dried. but it grew along the draw in stands thick enough to yield logs 6 inches through without walking far, and peeling green cottonwood was work a man could do sitting down when his knee would not let him stand. Tollef sat on the creek gravel with the hatchet and a flat stone and stripped bark in long curling sheets, working each log until the wood underneath was slick and pale. The shavings piled around him like shed skin. By the fourth log, his hands had stopped bleeding and started cracking. By the sixth log, the cracks had hardened into something that was not quite callus and not quite scar. He smeared axle grease from a tin he had found in the section camp onto the finished logs and onto his hands, and for a moment both the wood and the skin looked the same. Dark, greased, functional, and past caring about appearance. 8 logs, peeled and greased, laid across the creek bed 2 feet apart, staked on both ends. The roller path ran from the boxcar's current position upstream to the narrow bend. 200 yards. On flat ground with a good team, it would be an afternoon's work. On creek gravel with a canted car, a bad knee, and borrowed oxen he did not yet have permission to use, it would be something else entirely. Tollef sent word to Ragna. She came that evening, walking the draw in the last light. She tested each log with her boot, pressing down to see if it rolled on the stakes. She checked the spacing. She walked the full path, counting steps, looking at the grade. The draw sloped gently upward toward the narrow bend, which meant the car would be dragged slightly uphill. Harder on the team, but better for drainage. "The path will work," she said. "But your third log is set on loose gravel. When the car crosses it, the weight will push the log into the gravel, and it will jam. Dig out the gravel and set it on clay." Tollef dug out the gravel the next morning and reset the log. Ragna did not come back to check. She had told him once. That was how she taught. The days shortened. October was coming. The grass along the draw turned from green to brown to pale gold, and in the mornings the frost lasted past sunrise. Tollef counted days the way a man with a wound counts bandages. Each one used was one fewer remaining. 10 days until Pryor's notice expired. Roughly 10 weeks until deep winter, and he had not moved the car a single inch. He needed Lut's oxen, and Lut was waiting for Ragna's word. Tollef walked to Ragna's soddy on the 9th day of Pryor's notice. He found her splitting willow sticks for kindling, her sawed knife driven into the chopping block like a monument. "The path is ready," he said. "The third log is reset on clay. The stakes are driven to 14 inches. Ragna, I need you to tell Lut the bank will hold." Ragna set down the willow bundle. "The bank will hold the car," she said. "I cannot tell Lut his oxen will survive the pull. That depends on you, the grade, and whether the car jams on the roof seam when it crosses the 5th roller." She looked at him. "I can tell him what I know. I cannot promise what I do not." "That is enough." Ragna picked up her sawed knife from the chopping block and turned it in her hand. "I will go with you when you move it," she said. "Not to pull, to watch the bank. If the clay shears, I will see it before you do, and I will call the stop before the car buries itself." It was the first time she had offered to be present for the work itself. Tollef understood what it meant. She was not lending her labor. She was lending her judgment, which was worth more. He walked to Lut's farm that evening. Lut was feeding the oxen, pouring cracked corn from a bucket into a trough. The animals were massive, 1,500 pounds each, broad across the chest, patient in the way that creatures who have pulled heavy loads their whole lives become patient. "Ragna says the bank will hold the car," Tollef said. "She will come to watch the bank during the pull. She cannot promise the team, but she can promise the ground." Lute poured the last of the corn. He set the bucket down. He looked at the oxen, then at Tolef. "One afternoon," Lute said. "Not one day. One afternoon. If the car has not moved by the time the light drops behind the ridge, I pull the team, and you are on your own." "One afternoon," Tolef said, "and I am not helping you. I'm protecting my team. If the tongue cracks or the hitch starts to bend, I pull them out and you can talk to the car yourself." "Understood." Lute paused. "Pryor will hear about it." "Pryor has already heard about everything." Lute almost smiled. It was the closest thing to approval Tolef had received since he climbed down from the work train. The afternoon came. The sky was low and gray, the kind of sky that cannot decide between rain and nothing. Tolef had everything in place: 8 greased rollers, staked and leveled, a crude windlass built from a wagon axle, 2 salvaged railroad ties driven into the creek bank as anchor posts, and 60 feet of rope wound around the axle in a spiral that Tolef had tested 3 times. The car sat at the bottom of the roller path, still canted, still listing, still looking like exactly what the town called it: a wooden grave waiting for an occupant. Lute arrived with 4 oxen, his 2 and 2 more borrowed from a farmer who owed him seed money. He did not explain the extra team. He hitched them in pairs to a doubletree rigged to the windlass rope and backed them into position. Ragna stood on the east bank above the narrow bend, watching the clay wall where the car would come to rest. She held a willow stick in one hand. If she raised it, the pull stopped. The first pull moved the car 3 inches. The gravel screamed under the frame. One roller cracked but held. The oxen leaned into the yokes, their hooves cutting trenches in the creek bed. Lute said nothing. He watched the hitch. The second pull gave 8 inches. The car groaned, a deep wooden sound that came from the frame itself, as if the structure was remembering what it meant to move. The listing corrected slightly as the south side climbed onto the first roller. Then nothing. The third pull produced no movement at all. The windlass rope hummed tight as a fiddle string. Lute checked the hitch. Tolef crawled under the canted floor and found the problem. A stone half buried in gravel had lodged against the frame's bottom edge. The car could not pass over it. He lay on his back under 20,000 pounds of listing boxcar and swung the hatchet sideways at the stone. Each blow sent gravel into his face. The car creaked above him. Rana from the bank called down, "If that frame drops 2 inches, it will not stop." Tolef swung again. The stone cracked and shifted. He kicked it sideways with his good leg and rolled out from under the car just as Lute called the team forward. The car lurched. The 4th pull, 5th pull, 6th. Each one measured in inches, then feet. The rollers turned under the weight, grease and clay mixing into a dark paste. One ox went to its knees on the loose gravel, and Lute hauled it up by the horn yoke with a sound that was half command and half prayer. The car crossed the 5th roller where Ragna had predicted a jam. The split roof seam caught on the roller's crown. The whole car shuddered. Tolef jammed a cottonwood wedge under the leading edge, and the car slid over with a sound like tearing cloth. 50 feet. 100. The banks narrowed. Ragna watched the east wall, her willow stick steady at her side. She did not raise it. At 180 feet, the car entered the narrow bend. The east wall was 2 inches from the planking. The west wall touched. Clay crumbled against the car's side and fell in dry chunks into the creek bed. "Stop," Ragna said. Lute halted the team. Everyone stood still. The car sat in the bend with its east side nearly touching the bank and its west side pressed against clay. 4 inches of clearance on one side, contact on the other. The floor was roughly level for the first time since the derailment. The roof, damaged but present, cleared the bank tops by 2 feet. Ragna descended into the draw. She pressed her palm against the east bank beside the car. She pressed her palm against the west bank. She crouched and looked at the base where the frame met the creekbed gravel. "It will hold," she said. Tolliff leaned against the car and let his weight go onto his good leg. His bad knee had stopped sending pain signals an hour ago, which was not a good sign. His hands were bleeding again through the axle grease. The sky was darkening toward the ridge. Lute unhitched the team without speaking. The oxen stood in the creek bed, steaming, their breath visible in the cooling air. Lute ran his hand along the lead ox's neck and said, to the animal and not to Tolliff, "That is the last time." Then he looked at Tolliff. "You have a box in a ditch, Brecca. You still do not have a house." He drove the team out of the draw and up the bank road toward his farm. Ragina followed, stopping at the rim to look back. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start with the south gap. Bring the sawed knife from my chopping block, and soak your knee in cold water tonight, or you will not bend it in the morning." She walked away into the gathering dark. Tolliff stood alone in the creek bed beside a wrecked boxcar wedged into a narrow bend with 4 inches of clearance and no margin for error. The wind passed over the draw and did not touch him. The first stars appeared above the bank tops, framed by earth on both sides, and for the first time in weeks the air around Tolliff was still. He had moved the car. He had not yet made it a home. The south gap was 3 feet wide and open to weather. The north gap was 18 inches. The roof was exposed. The door worked but warped. He had no stove collar, no interior bracing, and no sod on the walls. He had $6.11 remaining, flour for 9 days, beans for 4, and a knee that might or might not carry him through tomorrow. Winter was 10 weeks away. Prior's notice had 1 day left, and the town was already saying that Tolliff Brecca had dragged his own coffin into a ditch and nailed the lid shut from the inside. Prior's 10-day notice expired on a Tuesday. No one came to strip the car. Tolliff did not know why. He did not ask. He suspected that Prior had expected the project to collapse on its own, that a limping man with bleeding hands and a boxcar wedged into a ditch would abandon the work before the notice ran out. When that did not happen, Prior had to decide whether sending men into the draw to disassemble a car that a Norwegian had already half buried was worth the labor cost. Apparently it was not. Not yet. But the notice still existed. Prior had not withdrawn it. The threat sat in the county clerk's office like a loaded cartridge in an open drawer, and Tolliff understood that Prior would pick it up again the moment it suited him. He could not think about Prior. He had a south gap 3 feet wide and open to weather, a north gap of 18 inches, an exposed roof, a warped door, and no stove collar. He had flour for 9 days, beans for 4, $6.11, and a knee that Ragna had told him to soak in cold water. He had soaked it. It bent this morning. That was enough. Ragna arrived before sunrise with her sawed knife and a flat spade she carried over one shoulder like a rifle. She did not greet him. She walked into the draw, stood in the south gap between the boxcar wall and the creek bank, and looked at the 3 feet of open space the way a surgeon looks at a wound. "We start at the bottom," she said. "Clay first, then sod. The clay seals the base where water will push hardest. The sod holds the clay and gives the wall weight above." She crouched and pressed her hand into the creek bed at the base of the gap. "Dig this out 6 inches and pack it with the gray clay from upstream, not the brown clay, the gray. The brown has sand in it and will wash." Tolliff dug. Ragna cut sod. She used Lute's breaking plow, which Lute had left near the draw without explanation or acknowledgement. The plow cut strips of dense root prairie grass 18 inches wide, and Rana walked behind it with the spade, trimming the strips into bricks roughly 12 inches wide and 4 inches thick. Each brick weighed close to 30 pounds when the roots were thick. She stacked them grass side down on the creek bank, and when Tolliff asked why grass side down, she said, "The roots grip downward. If you lay them grass up, the roots reach for sun and pull the brick apart. Grass down, the roots bind into the course below. The wall becomes one piece." She showed him how to stagger the courses the way a mason staggers stone, each brick overlapping the seam of the course below, so that no crack ran straight through the wall. She showed him how to tamp the seams with the flat of the spade, pressing until the fibers interlocked. She showed him how to press a thumb into the finished course and read the result. If the thumbprint held clean, the sod was packed tight enough. If the thumbprint crumbled at the edges, the course needed wetting and retamping. None of this was lecture. She cut, she placed, she pressed, and Tolliff watched her hands and did what her hands did. When he placed a brick wrong, root side up on the third course, she pulled it out without speaking and turned it over. He did not make the mistake again. The south gap took 4 days. 3 feet of open space became 2 feet of packed clay base, topped by 18 inches of staggered sod bricks, each course tamped and tested. The wall was not pretty. It was lumpy, uneven, dark with moisture, and it smelled like the earth it came from. But when Tolliff pressed his palm against the inside face, the wall did not give. When wind crossed the draw, the gap no longer funneled air into the car. The north gap took 2 days. 18 inches was narrow enough that the sod courses could bridge from the bank face to the car wall in a single brick width, and Ragna showed Tolliff how to wedge thin clay shims into the contact points, so the sod pressed tight against the wood without leaving air channels. "Air is patient," she said. "It will find a seam you cannot see and pull heat out of your room all winter while you wonder why the stove is not enough." She pressed a clay shim into a hairline gap between the top course and the boxcar planking. "Every seam you leave is a seam winter will use." The roof was harder. The boxcar roof had split along one seam where the derailment had torqued the frame. The split ran 8 feet along the center, and daylight showed through it in a thin, bright line that moved as the sun crossed. Rain would follow the same path. Snow would pack into the crack and melt downward. Tolliff needed to seal the split from above, but the roof was 11 feet off the creek bed floor, and climbing onto damaged planking with a bad knee was the kind of decision that killed men who had run out of better options. Ragna solved it without climbing. She had Tolliff lay a bed of clay paste along the inside of the split, pressing it upward with a flat board lashed to a pole. The clay paste filled the crack from below. Then, from outside the car, she directed Tolliff to lay sod strips across the roof seam, grass side down, overlapping the split by 2 feet on each side. The sod weight pressed the clay paste tight. The seal was not waterproof in the way that a shingled roof is waterproof. It was waterproof in the way that a sod house roof is waterproof. It held until it did not, and then you packed it again. "A sod roof leaks," Ragna said. "Every sod roof. The question is whether it leaks onto your bed or onto your floor. Place your bed away from the seam. Sleep dry. Fix the leak when the weather lets you." By the 3rd week of October, the car was sealed on 3 sides and the roof. The south wall was sod-packed. The north wall was sod-packed. The east end, where the car pressed against the steep bank, was insulated by the earth itself, 4 feet of clay and root between the inside wall and the open air. The west end held the door, which Rana had not yet addressed because the door was the last seal and the most complicated. The door was the original sliding freight door, hung on an iron track bolted to the car's header. It still rolled, though it stuck at the midpoint where the track had bent during the derailment. Tolliff straightened the track with a hammer and a cottonwood block, tapping the iron back into line over 2 patient hours. The door closed, but a sliding door on an iron track leaves gaps. A 1/4 inch on the sides where the door meets the frame, 1/2 inch at the bottom where the track sits above the sill. Those gaps were enough for wind to enter, and wind entering a sealed room meant heat leaving. Ragna cut felt strips from a horse blanket Tolliff had bought for 30 cents at the livery, and showed him how to tack them along the door frame as gaskets. The felt compressed when the door closed, filling the 1/4 inch gaps. For the bottom gap, she packed a rolled strip of sod against the outside sill, a removable draft stop that could be kicked away to open the door and pressed back into place when it closed. "The door is the weakest wall," she said. "Everything else is earth and wood. The door is iron and air. Treat it like a wound that keeps reopening." The stove was the last piece and the most dangerous. Tolliff had no stove. He had the tin stove lid from the section camp and a cast iron firebox he had traded $2 for at the livery assault, a squat, cracked thing the size of a feed bucket, designed for a railroad shanty and abandoned when the crack let smoke into the room. Ragna looked at the crack and said it could be sealed with clay paste and wire, which it could. The firebox would not heat a house, but it would heat a sealed box 9 feet wide and 34 feet long if the air inside had nowhere to go. The stovepipe was a 3-inch section of tin Tolliff had rolled from scrap and sealed with clay at the seams. It was ugly, uneven, and functional. The question was where to punch it through the wall and how to keep the surrounding wood from catching fire. Ragna refused Tolliff's first plan, which was to run the pipe straight up through the roof. "Through the roof means through the sod," she said. "The sod will dry around the pipe and crack. Rain will follow the crack down. In 2 months you will have a leak you cannot fix without tearing the roof apart." Instead, she had him punch the pipe through the upper side wall, the south wall, above the sod line, at an upward angle. The pipe passed through a hole cut in the planking and surrounded by a collar of packed clay 4 inches thick. The clay insulated the wood from the pipe's heat. Outside, the pipe rose 2 feet above the sod line, capped with a tin cone Tolliff hammered from a piece of salvaged flashing. Then Ragna taught the lesson that would matter most. "A fire in a sealed room will kill you," she said. She was standing inside the car, looking at the closed door, the packed walls, the sealed roof. The space was dark, still, and airless. "Not from burning, from breathing. The fire eats the air. If you seal every crack and light that stove without giving the room a way to breathe, you will fall asleep and not wake up." She made Tolliff cut a fresh air notch in the lower south wall near the door. The notch was 6 inches wide and 4 inches tall, covered by a sliding board that could be opened or closed. When open, it allowed outside air to enter at floor level. The cold air would sink to the floor, feed the stove, and the hot air would rise and exit through the pipe, a draft loop, a breathing room. "Open this when the fire is lit," Ragna said. "Close it when the fire is out and you are sleeping under blankets. If you wake up and the room smells wrong, thick, heavy, like the air has weight, open the door. Do not think about it. Open the door." She made him repeat it. He repeated it. November came wet. Rain turned the clay packing to paste on the outside walls, and Tolliff spent 2 days retamping seams that had softened. The sod held, but the clay between the sod and the boxcar planking wept moisture that beaded on the inside walls. Ragna told him to expect it. "The wall will sweat until the sod roots bind," she said. "Wipe it down. Do not panic. A sweating wall is a wall that is sealing itself. The roof leaked, not at the main seam which the sod and clay had sealed, but at a secondary split near the east end that Tolef had not noticed. He fixed it the way Ragna had taught, clay paste from below, sod strip from above, weight and patience. Prior stole the best iron strap from the wreck pile. Tolef discovered it missing on a morning when frost whitened the sod roof for the first time. The strap had been part of the car's original bracing, a flat iron bar 2 inches wide that Tolef had planned to use as a door latch reinforcement. It was gone. The ground where it had lain showed boot prints and wagon ruts. Tolef did not go to town to confront Prior. He fashioned a door latch from a bent spike and a strip of oak torn from the car's damaged undercarriage. It was uglier. It worked. His knee swelled on the 1st of November so badly that he cut sod sitting on the creek bed gravel, swinging the spade sideways from a position that would have looked absurd to anyone watching. No one was watching. Ragna had left 3 days earlier to deliver a baby at a farm north of Broken Bow, and without her, Tolef made his first serious mistake. He packed the upper south seam, the joint where the sod wall met the boxcar planking above the door, with loose sand instead of clay. He did not realize the difference until Ragna returned and pressed her thumb into the seam. The thumbprint collapsed. Sand grains poured out of the joint like sugar from a torn bag. She did not raise her voice. She dug the entire seam out by hand, pulling sand and loose sod from a joint that had taken Tolef a full day to pack. The work of a day removed in 20 minutes. Sand drains, she said. That is what sand does. It does not seal, it does not bind, and it does not hold. If you had left this and lit the stove, the heat would have dried the sand and the seam would have opened by December. You would have lost half your heat through a crack you could not see because it was above your head. Tolef repacked the seam with clay. It took another full day. Ragana watched him do it and did not help. When he finished, she pressed her thumb into the new work. The thumbprint held clean. Better, she said. That was all. Unexpected help arrived at the end of November, disguised as something else. Lute Harwick drove a wagon to the draw at dusk and unloaded a stack of buffalo grass sod, thick, root-dense bricks cut from a patch of unbroken prairie near his property line. There were enough bricks to add a second course to the roof, which was the weakest point of the structure. Tolef came out of the car and looked at the stack. I'm not helping, Lute said. I'm protecting my reputation. If you die in that thing, people will say my oxen put you there. If you live, nobody will remember the oxen at all. He climbed back onto the wagon. The wife says you can have the sod. She does not say you can visit. He drove away. Tolef laid the second roof course the next morning, working alone, carrying 30-pound bricks up a crude ladder he had built from cottonwood poles and lashed with rope. Each brick was a separate climb. His knees screamed on every rung. By afternoon, the roof was double-layered, and when he stood inside and pressed upward with his palm, the roof did not flex. Anson Vale returned on the 3rd day of December. He rode his bay horse to the edge of the draw and sat looking down at a mound that had not been there 2 months ago. The boxcar was no longer visible from above. It looked like a grassed-over hillock tucked into the creek bend, with a single door visible on the west face and a tin stovepipe rising from the south side. If Vale had not known what was underneath, he might have ridden past it. He dismounted and descended into the draw. Tolef was inside, hanging a borrowed thermometer from a nail on the boxcar rib. The thermometer had come from Beret Solheim's schoolroom, loaned without explanation, delivered by a student who said the teacher thought someone might want to measure something. Vale ducked through the door and stood inside. The air was still. No draft. The walls were dry. The sweating had stopped as the sod roots bound. The cracked firebox sat on a clay pad with the stovepipe angled upward through its collar. The floor was boxcar planking, buckled but swept clean. A bedroll lay at the far end, away from the roof seam, exactly as Ragna had instructed. Vale pressed on the sod-packed south wall. It did not give. He pressed on the roof. He stopped. "The roof ribs," he said. "These are the original boxcar roof bows. They were not built to carry earth weight. They were built to keep rain off grain sacks." He rapped a knuckle against a bough. The wood sounded solid, but the span was long, 9 feet without interior support. "Snow loads. A wet snow on top of sod will double the weight in an hour. These bows will fold." Ragna, who had followed Vale into the draw without announcing herself, said from the doorway, "He is right." Tollef looked at the roof boughs. He had not considered snow load beyond the sod itself. A heavy wet snow could add hundreds of pounds to the roof. The boughs were 2x4 oak, strong for their original purpose but not designed to carry a burial mound. Ragna showed him the solution that afternoon: internal crib posts. Short vertical timbers cut from salvaged railroad ties, stood on the floor and wedged tight under the roof bows. Spaced 4 feet apart along the car's length, they transferred the roof load straight down to the floor and the gravel beneath it. Each post was a separate support, so if one settled, the others held. Tollef cut 9 ties to length and drove them in with a sledge borrowed from Lute. Each post was wedged with oak shims until the fit was so tight that striking the post with a palm produced no movement. Vale watched the crib posts go in. He did not help. When the last post was wedged, he rapped his knuckle against it. The sound was dead. No vibration, no give. "The door still rattles in a crosswind," Vale said. He did not say whether the crib post satisfied him. He mounted his horse and rode toward the bridge road. At the rim, he turned back. "I will check this draw after the first hard storm. If the structure is shifted, I will condemn it and you will leave." It was not approval, but it was not the coffin speech again either. By late December, the sunk car was as finished as Tollef could make it alone. The exterior was a grassed-over mound that birds had begun to land on, mistaking it for natural ground. One end was buried in the creek bank. The other held the sliding door with its felt gaskets and sod draft stop. The stovepipe rose from the south side, and on cold mornings, a thin line of wood smoke climbed straight up from the tin cone. The draw was so still that smoke did not scatter. Inside, the thermometer told the story. On a night in mid-December, when a conventional shack in town froze water near the door, the sunk car held above freezing with a fire no bigger than a hatful of willow twigs. Tollef scratched the results into the door frame with a nail: outside temperature, inside temperature, fuel used. 3 marks per day. A record that no one had asked for and that Tollef kept because his father had taught him that a man who does not measure does not know. The fuel economy was visible to anyone who looked. Tollef's woodpile was a stack of willow bundles and scrap cottonwood that would not have filled a quarter cord. His neighbors, the ones who had proper soddies or plank shacks, had stacked 3, 4, 5 cords of firewood against their walls and were already burning through it. The difference was surface area and wind exposure. A sod house sat on the prairie with 4 walls open to the wind. The sunk car sat below grade with one face exposed and 3 sides packed in earth. The earth did not need to be heated. It only needed to be kept from losing what heat the stove provided. But Tollef did not say any of this to anyone. He scratched his marks on the door frame and kept the stove small. Pryor shifted tactics in January. He no longer called the sunk car foolish. He called it illegal. He told the county road committee that Tolliff had obstructed a drainage course and created a flood hazard. A hearing was set for January 15th. Tolliff would have to stand in front of men who had never seen the inside of the sunk car and explain why a wrecked rail car buried in a creek bed was not a danger to the county's water flow. The hearing was 3 weeks away. The temperature had not yet tested the structure. The real cold had not come. And in the first week of January, the weather did something that made Ragna uneasy. It warmed. The air softened. Eaves dripped. Children walked to school without heavy wraps. Men stood outside the store and talked about an easy winter. Ragna stood outside her soddy and looked north. She said to Tolliff, who had come to return her sawed knife, "Warmth before a north wind is a door left open." Tolliff asked what she meant. She said she did not know exactly. She said her bones knew things her mouth could not explain. She said he should make sure the air notch slid freely and the stovepipe was clear. He went home and checked both. January 12th, 1888, a Monday. The morning was mild, warm enough that Tolliff left the sunk car without his heavy coat. He walked to Broken Bow to buy lamp wick and a pound of flour. The sky was hazy, the air still, and the temperature felt like late March instead of deep January. People on the square were smiling. A man outside the general store said he might plow early this year. Tolliff bought his wick and flour. He stood on the store porch and looked north. The sky had changed. Not the color, the texture. The northern horizon had thickened into something that was not cloud and not clear, but a gray wall that seemed to press downward as it moved. The air shifted, not a gust. A pressure change, as if someone had opened a door in a sealed room and the atmosphere was rearranging itself to fill the gap. The temperature dropped. Not slowly, not in the way that evening cold replaces afternoon warmth. It dropped the way a stone drops, fast, hard, and with the weight of something that had been held above and suddenly released. In the time it took Tolliff to walk from the store porch to the livery corner, the air went from shirt-sleeve weather to cutting cold. His ears burned. His fingers tightened on the flour sack. The haze was gone, replaced by a white nothing that rolled down from the north and ate the buildings one by one. Wind hit, not prairie wind which builds and shifts and gives a man time to lean into it. This wind arrived fully formed, horizontal, packed with ice crystals that struck exposed skin like gravel. Visibility collapsed. Tolliff could see the livery wall 10 feet away and nothing beyond it. The sound was not a howl. It was a roar, steady, enormous, without the rise and fall that wind usually carries. It sounded like the inside of a freight car moving at speed, and Tolliff knew that sound, and the memory made his chest tighten. He heard children. Beret Solheim's voice came from somewhere east of the square, not screaming, but raised to a pitch that cut through the wind. She was calling names. She had released the older students, but 2 younger children, a brother and sister whose father farmed south of town, had not been collected. Beret was trying to walk them to the livery where she thought they could shelter, but the wind had turned the 50-yard walk into a blind stagger. Tolliff found them by sound. Beret had the girl under one arm and the boy gripping her coat hem. The girl was crying without sound, her mouth open, her voice lost in the roar. The boy was not crying. His face was blank in the way that children's faces go blank when fear overloads them. "The livery!" Beret shouted. "The livery is east!" Tolliff shouted back. "We passed it." They had. The wind had pushed them south without their knowing. In the white nothing, direction was a guess. Tolliff could not see the store. He could not see the square. He could see Beret's face, the 2 children, and approximately 4 feet of frozen ground. A voice came from the white. Orrin Pike, Pryor's hired man, materialized from the wind like something the storm had made. He was hatless, his face already reddening. "The draw road," Pike said. "It is shorter. Take the draw road south and get below the banks." The draw road. The road that ran along the creek bed toward the sunk car. Pike was right. The draw walls would block the wind. But the draw was 2.5 miles from town, and walking 2.5 miles in a blizzard with 2 children was not a plan. It was a prayer. Tollef looked at Beret. Beret looked at the white nothing that had been a town. "The draw road," Tollef said. "If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the thing everyone mocked as a grave is about to be tested with children inside it and no way back to town." They walked south. Tollef led, holding the boy's hand. Beret followed with the girl, Thea. Pike walked behind them, which Tollef did not question, because questioning anything in a blizzard was a waste of breath that could not be spared. Tollef found the draw road by feel. His boots hit the ruts left by Lute's wagon, and the frozen ruts guided his feet the way rails guide a car. He counted steps. He had walked this road 100 times. He knew the landmarks. The leaning fence post at the quarter mile, the stone pile at the half mile, the cottonwood stump at the first bend. He could not see any of them. He counted steps instead, and when the count reached what he estimated as the first bend, he stopped. The wind changed. Not in strength, it was still a wall of moving ice, but in direction. It came from above now, not from the side. The draw walls. They had entered the draw. The banks rose on either side, and the wind screamed over the top of them like water over a ledge. Tollef could see the ground, not far, 8 feet, maybe 10. But the creek bed was sheltered enough that the ice crystals flew overhead instead of into their faces. The girl stopped crying. The boy lifted his head. They walked. 1 mile, 1.5. Tollef's knee had stopped sending signals again, which meant it had gone past pain into something else. He did not think about it. He counted steps. Pike fell. Not dramatically. He simply sat down in the creekbed gravel and did not get up. Tollef went back. Pike's face was gray-white on the left side where the wind had struck during the walk from town. His hands were bare. He had lost his gloves somewhere between the square and the draw road. "Get up," Tollef said. "I will rest," Pike said. His voice was calm, the calm of a man whose body was making decisions his mind had not approved. Tollef pulled him up. Pike weighed more than Tollef, and Tollef's knee buckled sideways and nearly dropped them both. Beret caught Pike's other arm. They moved. 4 people in a creek bed in a blizzard, walking toward a buried boxcar that the town called a grave. The sunk car appeared as an absence, a place where the wind stopped. The grassed-over mound was invisible under driving snow, but the door pocket was there, the west-facing entry where the draw wall curved to meet the car. Tollef reached for the door. It was buried. 4 feet of wind-packed snow had drifted into the door pocket, piling against the sliding door in a wall of compressed white. The door could not open. The felt gaskets, the sawed draft stop, the iron track, all of it was behind 4 feet of hard-packed drift. Tollef set the boy against the mound wall where the wind could not reach. He set the girl beside him. He told Beret to hold them. He reached under his coat and pulled out the tin stove lid. The stove lid. The same one he had carried under his arm the night the railroad dismissed him. The same one he had propped against the wind his first night in the draw. The same one that Anson Vale had tapped with his cane and said, "You have this, and 60 bent nails." Tollef had kept it because a man with nothing does not throw things away. He had used it as a shovel, a scraper, a fire shield, and a cutting board. Now he used it as an entrenching tool. He dug. The snow was not powder. It was wind-packed and dense, and each scoop with the stove lid moved a few pounds at a time. His hands cramped. His knee buckled twice. Snow filled the gap behind him as fast as he could clear the front. Beret set the children against the wall and began scooping with her bare hands beside him. It took 15 minutes. It felt like an hour. When the door edge appeared, the dark iron of the track frosted white, Tolliff drove the stove lid into the gap between door and frame and levered. The door slid 6 inches. Snow collapsed into the opening. He cleared it, levered again. The door slid a foot, 2 feet. Enough. He pushed the children through first, then Beret, then Pike, who had to be guided because his hands could not grip the door frame, then himself. Inside was dark. The air was cold, but still, utterly, completely still. The wind was a memory. The roar was gone, replaced by a muffled hum that came from above, from the snow and sod pressing down on the roof, from the storm passing over the mound the way a river passes over a stone. Tolliff found the stove by touch, the cracked firebox sealed with clay and wire, sitting on its clay pad. He found the willow kindling by touch. He found the matches, 5 remaining in a tin box nailed to the wall rib. He struck one. The flame was enormous in the darkness. The children's faces appeared. Beret's face appeared. Pike's face appeared, gray-white on one side, frightened on the other. He lit the kindling. The fire caught. Smoke rose, hit the stovepipe, and stopped. It curled back into the room. The pipe was blocked. Snow had capped the tin cone outside, sealing the flue. Ragna's lesson. Tolliff told Beret to open the air notch. She found the sliding board at the base of the south wall and pushed it open. Cold air rushed in at floor level, fresh, breathable, biting. The fire flickered and steadied, drawing air from the notch instead of from the room, but the smoke still had nowhere to go. It pooled against the ceiling and began to descend. Tolliff grabbed a willow switch from the kindling pile, tied a rag to the end, and shoved it up the stovepipe from inside. He pushed until he felt resistance, the snow cap on the cone. He jabbed, once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th jab, the resistance gave. Cold air rushed down the pipe, hit the fire, and the fire roared. Smoke reversed direction and climbed the pipe. In 30 seconds, the air cleared. The room began to warm, not quickly, not the way a well-stoked stove in a plank house throws heat into a room. Slowly, like a held breath releasing. The firebox was small. The fuel was willow twigs and cottonwood scraps, but the room was sealed. The earth held the heat in. The wind could not find the walls, and the heated air had nowhere to go except into the small space where 5 people breathed. The thermometer. Tolliff found it on its nail and held it near the stove. 50 degrees, then 55, then 60. With a fire no bigger than what a man could hold in both hands cupped, the sunk car climbed to 60 degrees while outside the draw, the temperature dropped below 0 and the wind drove snow sideways at a speed that killed cattle standing in the open. Beret noticed first. She had pressed the children against the south wall, the sod-packed wall, and the girl had pulled off her mittens. Beret felt the wall. "It is warm," she said. "Not hot, not room temperature. Warm." The earth on the other side of the sod was holding the stove's heat like a bank holds money, receiving it slowly, storing it, releasing it back. The boy fell asleep against the wall. The girl followed. Their breathing was steady and visible in the faint stove light, and the sound of children breathing in a warm room while a killing storm raged above was a sound that Tolliff would hear for the rest of his life. Lute Harwick arrived 2 hours later. His wife had gone missing between the house and the hay cut, a walk of 200 yards that the storm had turned into a death sentence. Lute had searched until his hands went numb, then followed the creek bed by touch and instinct, the same way Tollef had followed the draw road. He did not find the door. He found the buried south wall and pounded on it with his fists. Tollef heard it, a deep, rhythmic thumping that came through the boxcar planking and the sod and the clay like a heartbeat transmitted through earth. Wood carries sound. The boxcar wall was a membrane between the living and the dying, and when Lute's fist struck the outside, the inside reverberated. Tollef dug outward. The door had drifted shut again, fresh snow piling against it every few minutes, and he cleared it a second time with the stove lid. Lute came through the opening on his hands and knees. His beard was white. His coat was crusted with ice. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had decided that the next place he entered was the last place he would ever enter. "My wife," he said. Tollef did not know where Lute's wife was. He could not go out to search. The storm was beyond human movement. He brought Lute inside and set him beside the stove. Lute sat on the boxcar floor and placed his bare hand against the sod-packed seam beside the door. He held it there for a long time. "No draft," he said. Those two words were the practical skeptic's conversion. They were not dramatic. They were not a speech. They were the words of a man who had spent his adult life measuring what things cost and what things delivered, and who now sat inside a buried boxcar in a blizzard with a fire the size of a dinner plate, and who felt no draft. The night was long. The storm did not relent. The sound changed as the hours passed. The roar softened into a steady hiss as snow packed deeper over the mound, insulating the roof further, and the hiss became the only evidence that a blizzard existed above them. Inside, the stove ticked. The children slept. Beret sat with her back against the wall and her eyes open, watching the stove light move on the ceiling. Pike lay near the door, his damaged face turned away. Tollef had wrapped his hands in flour sacking and placed him where the air notch provided fresh air without direct cold. He had done this for the man whose employer had kicked his stakes loose and called him a drifter. He had not thought about it. A man was freezing. The door was there. The door opened. Anson Vale's storm shed failed that night. Tollef would learn this later, but the failure was happening now, a mile and a half north, where Vale's conventional plank shelter, above grade, visible, ventilated, built on dry ground, everything Vale had prescribed, lost its door to the wind. The hinges pulled from the frame. One of Vale's hired boys caught frostbite on both hands before reaching the schoolhouse in town. The ventilation that Vale had insisted upon became a funnel for wind that dropped the interior temperature to match the outside in minutes. The sunk car held. It held because it had no ventilation to exploit. It held because the wind could not find the walls. It held because the earth around it absorbed the cold the way a stone absorbs a wave, taking the force, holding it, giving nothing back. It held because Ragna had taught Tollef to seal every seam and cut every air channel with intention. It held because 9 crib posts braced the roof under a weight of snow and sod that would have collapsed the original structure. It held because the fresh air notch provided exactly enough oxygen to feed a small fire and 5 sets of lungs without opening the room to the killing draft outside. Morning came not through a window. There were no windows, but as a change in the sound above. The hiss faded. The pressure changed. Tollef rose from the floor, where he had not slept, and went to the door. He dug upward with the stove lid. The snow was 3 feet deep over the door pocket. He broke through to daylight that was pale, flat, and impossibly bright after a night in an earthen room. Anson Vale stood outside. He had walked from town at first light, following the draw road, expecting to find a body. He stood at the lip of the draw and looked down at the grassed-over mound with snow packed smooth across its surface and a man climbing out of a hole in the ground carrying a tin stove lid. Behind Tolef, through the open door, children's voices. A woman's voice. A man coughing. Vale looked at the mound. He looked at the stovepipe, which had a cap of ice around its rim, where the warm smoke had met the freezing air. He looked at Tolef's face, which was haggard, unshaved, and alive. He did not speak. He stood on the bank with ice in his beard and looked at the structure he had called a coffin, and he did not speak because there was nothing to say that the mound had not already said. Tolef climbed back through the door to check the children. The storm lasted into the second day. When it finally broke, the prairie looked like something that had been erased and redrawn in white. Drifts buried fence lines. Stock pens had vanished. The road between Broken Bow and the Draw was a suggestion under 3 feet of packed snow. People counted bodies before they counted anything else. The children from Beret's school were alive. Lute's wife was alive. She had crawled into the hay cut and buried herself under loose timothy until the wind stopped, and she lost 2 fingers on her left hand to frostbite, but kept the rest. Orrin Pike was alive because Tolef had opened the door. A hired boy north of town lost the use of both hands. 2 cattle herds south of the river were wiped out entirely, the animals found standing frozen in the positions they had died in, coated in ice, facing away from the wind. The blizzard of January 12, 1888, killed people across Nebraska that day. The stories would accumulate for months. Children lost between schoolhouse and home, men frozen 50 yards from their own doors, women found clutching infants in snowbanks. The distance between survival and death was measured in feet, and the measurement had nothing to do with strength or character. It had to do with shelter. Who had it? Who did not? And what the shelter was made of. Anson Vale returned to the sunk car 4 days after the storm. He came on foot this time, leaving the bay horse tied at the bridge. He descended into the draw, carrying a notebook and a pencil, and he did not announce himself. Tolef was inside, replacing the felt gasket on the doorframe, where the repeated digging and forcing had torn it loose. He looked up when Vale ducked through the entrance. Vale did not speak for several minutes. He walked the interior the way he had walked it in December, pressing walls, testing the roof, rapping knuckles against the crib posts. But this time he wrote things down. He measured the distance between posts with a length of cord. He measured the door frame. He measured the stovepipe collar, pressing his fingers around the clay packing where it met the planking. He crouched and examined the fresh air notch, sliding the board open and closed, feeling the draft with his palm. Then he stood in the center of the car, closed his notebook, and looked at Tolef. "I called it a coffin," Vale said. "I was wrong. A coffin does not breathe." The words fell into the still air of the sunk car and stayed there. Vale did not elaborate. He did not apologize. He was not a man who confused correction with apology. He had made a judgment. The storm had tested the judgment. The judgment had failed. He was recording the correction the way he recorded everything, in a notebook with a pencil in his own handwriting. "The crib posts held," he said. "The drainage trench held. The flue collar held. The air notch held." He tapped the notebook against his thigh. "The door is still your weakness. A crosswind will pack that pocket shut every time. You need an entry vestibule, a short-walled passage outside the door that breaks the drift pattern before it reaches the threshold." Tolef had not thought of that. He nodded. "I will withdraw my inspection concern with the road committee," Vale said. "The drainage course is not obstructed. The diversion trench functions. I will note that in my report." He paused at the door. Pryor's hearing is still set for the 15th. That is not my jurisdiction, but if the committee asks me whether this structure is a hazard, I will tell them what I saw. He climbed out of the draw. Tollef stood in the doorway and watched him go. A stiff-backed man in a wool coat, walking through snow that came to his knees, writing corrections in a notebook he carried everywhere because being wrong was tolerable and staying wrong was not. The visitors began the following week. They did not come in groups. They came one at a time, the way people approach something they have mocked, carefully, with reasons prepared in case someone asked why they were there. A farmer named Dahl came to return a hatchet Tollef had never lent him. A woman from town came to bring a jar of pickled beets for the children who had sheltered in the storm, though the children had gone home days ago. A teamster who hauled freight on the Broken Bow Road stopped his wagon at the draw, walked to the rim, and stood looking at the mound for 10 minutes before driving on without speaking. What they were doing was measuring, not with tools, with their eyes, their feet, their hands on the sod walls. They wanted to see how a man with $11 and a wrecked rail car had survived a storm that killed people in proper houses. They wanted to see the thermometer marks on the door frame. They wanted to feel the wall that did not pass wind. They wanted to know if the thing they had mocked was the thing they needed. Tollef did not charge. He did not lecture. When someone asked a question, he answered it. When someone asked to see the stovepipe collar, he showed it. When someone asked about the drainage trench, he walked them upstream and pointed at the cut. He did not say, "I told you so," because he had never told anyone anything. He had built the thing and let the storm speak for it. Ragna was present for several of these visits, standing near the doorway, listening. When Tollef explained the sod courses, she corrected him, "Grass side down, not grass side in. He is saying it backward." And the visitors looked at her and understood that the knowledge had more than one owner. When Tollef showed the air notch, Ragna said, "Tell them why." And Tollef told them about the fire eating the air and the need for a breathing room, and Ragna nodded once, which was her way of saying he had gotten it right. Lute Harwick came back, not to visit, to examine. He brought a hand level and a folding rule and spent an hour inside the sunk car, measuring wall thickness, post spacing, floor grade, and sod depth. He did not ask permission. Tollef did not object. When Lute finished, he sat on an upturned bucket near the stove and said, "I want to bank my north wall." "Bank it how?" Tollef said. "Earth and sod. 3 feet deep against the north face. Cut the wind exposure in half." "You will need a drainage slope on the uphill side," Tollef said. "If you pack earth against the wall without a drain, spring melt will push through the sod joint and rot your bottom course." Lute wrote it down. He had brought his own notebook. "And the seams," Ragna said from the doorway. "Clay, not sand. Gray clay." Lute wrote that down too. He stood, folded his rule, and looked at Tollef with the expression of a man who was recalculating a debt he had not known he owed. "My wife has 9 fingers because of this room," he said. "She would have 10 if I had listened to you before October." He left. The next morning, his oxen were at the draw again, dragging a sled loaded with sod bricks. Tollef did not ask why. He walked to Lute's farm and began marking the drainage slope on the north wall. The hearing on January 15th did not go the way Pryor expected. The county road committee met in the back room of the general store, 4 men, 2 of whom had sheltered neighbors during the storm, one of whom had lost a shed roof. Pryor presented his complaint. Tollef Brecka had obstructed a drainage course with an unauthorized structure, creating a flood hazard that endangered the county bridge downstream. Vale testified. He stood with his notebook open and read his measurements: the diversion trench dimensions, the drainage slope, the gap between the mound and the draw walls, the flow path of the creek bed around the structure. He concluded by saying that the structure did not obstruct drainage. It diverted drainage, which was a different thing, and the diversion was competently engineered. Pryor objected. He said Vail was not an engineer. Vail said, "I'm not an engineer. I'm a man who has inspected 200 miles of county roads and drainage courses in this district. The trench works, the water passes, the bridge is not endangered." Tollef was asked to speak. He stood and said 4 sentences. The boxcar had been abandoned by the railroad for 2 years. He had moved it to a location where it did not obstruct flow. The diversion trench carried water around the structure. 5 people, including 2 children, had survived the January 12th blizzard inside it. The committee dismissed Pryor's complaint. They did not do it warmly. They did it because the storm had made the complaint look petty, and no elected man in Custer County wanted to be the one who ordered the demolition of a shelter that had saved children. Pryor sat in his chair and did not leave when the others filed out. Tollef passed him on the way to the door. Pryor said quietly, so that only Tollef heard, "This is not finished, Brecka. A wreck in a ditch is not a precedent. If every vagrant on the line buries himself in a creek bed, this county will be a graveyard of squatters." Tollef did not answer. He walked into the January cold and back to the draw. February deepened the winter. The sunk car performed. Tollef's fuel consumption was visible now to anyone who compared. His wood piles shrank by handfuls where his neighbors' piles shrank by armloads. He burned willow twigs, cottonwood scraps, and dried buffalo chips. Fuel that a proper stove in a proper house would have consumed in an afternoon. The sunk car held its heat because the earth held the heat for it, and the sealed walls gave the wind nothing to work with. Ragna came most days. Their work had shifted from construction to refinement. She showed him how to line the interior walls with a whitewash made from creekbed calcium deposits, a thin paste that brightened the dark room and sealed the inner face of the sod against moisture. She showed him how to cut a shelf into the packed sod wall using the flat of the sod knife, creating storage that did not take floor space. She showed him how to hang a blanket across the car's width at the 20-foot mark, dividing the space into a heated front room and a cold back room for storing food that needed to stay cool but not freeze. These were not survival lessons. They were living lessons. The difference mattered. Survival was keeping the wind out. Living was making the space worth staying inside. Their work became collaborative in a way that Tollef had not experienced before. Ragna did not take direction, and she did not give orders. She worked beside him, and when she saw something wrong, she fixed it. And when she saw something right, she said nothing, which was her way of saying everything. Tollef began to anticipate her corrections, checking a seam before she could press it, angling a cut before she could point. She noticed. She said once, "You're learning to see what the wall needs before the wall tells you." It was the closest she came to praise. One evening in late February, Ragna sat on the floor of the sunk car with a cup of weak tea and told Tollef about her husband. Arne Moen had been a carpenter from Hallingdal who could build a door frame so true that a marble would not roll on the threshold. He had died of pneumonia in the second winter, in a soddy he had built himself, because the soddy had a draft he could not find, and the draft carried cold into his lungs while he slept. Ragna found the draft after he died. It was a hairline gap between the door frame and the sod course above it, invisible, silent, and fatal. He built beautiful things, she said, but he did not understand that a house is not a thing you build. It is a thing that builds you. It tests you. It finds the place where you were careless, and it punishes you there. She set the tea down. I learned to seal every crack because my husband died of one. Tollef did not say he was sorry. He said, "Show me the crack." The next morning, Ragna took him to her soddy and pointed at the door frame. The repair was visible. A line of dark clay pressed into a seam so fine that a knife blade would not fit. Tolliff knelt and looked at it. A hairline. A nothing. The width of a breath. "Every seam," he said. "Every seam," she said. Beret Solheim began visiting the sunk car in March. She came with a notebook, not Vale's kind, full of measurements and corrections, but a schoolteacher's kind, full of questions. She asked Tolliff to explain the drainage trench, and when he explained it poorly, she asked again with different words until the explanation made sense to someone who had never held a spade. She asked about the sod courses, the clay selection, the stovepipe collar, the air notch. She drew diagrams. She wrote dimensions in the margins. "Why are you writing this down?" Tolliff asked. "Because you will not," Beret said. "And because families are coming to Custer County every month who have never built anything and who will die in shacks that a prairie wind could fold. If your method works, and I was inside it when it worked, then someone needs to write it in a way that a Swedish farmer's wife can read and follow." Tolliff did not argue. He was not good at explaining. He was good at building. Beret was good at translating the building into words, and she asked the questions that Tolliff had never thought to answer because he had never needed to explain what his hands already knew. She challenged his silence. "If you do not speak," she said, one afternoon when Tolliff had answered 3 questions with gestures and grunts. "Pryor will speak for you. He is already telling people that buried shelters are dangerous, that they flood, that they suffocate families. He is telling them because you are not telling them otherwise." "The sunk car tells them," Tolliff said. "The sunk car tells the people who visit it. What about the people who cannot walk 2.5 miles? What about the families arriving in April who will need shelter by November?" Beret set her notebook on the boxcar floor. "You built something that works. Now someone has to explain it, or Pryor will explain it for you, and his explanation will end with a price tag." Ragna, listening from the doorway, said, "She is right." That was the moment Tolliff understood that the sunk car was no longer about his survival. It was about something he had not intended and did not know how to carry. Spring came early and mean. The snow melted fast in late March, faster than the ground could absorb it, and the draw that had been dry since September filled with brown water running south toward the county bridge. This was the test Ragna had warned about. Winter tested warmth. Spring tested everything else. The diversion trench worked, mostly. Water followed the cut Ragna had marked in October, flowing around the mound on the east side and rejoining the main channel below the sunk car. But the volume was higher than October's rain had suggested. The east bank, where the trench made its sharpest turn, began to erode. Water found the outside of the curve and chewed at the clay, widening the channel by inches each day. If it cut deep enough, the trench would breach and water would flow directly against the sunk car's south wall. Ragna was not there. She had fallen ill in early March, a lung infection that had started as a cough and deepened into something that rattled when she breathed. She was at Beret's boarding house in town, under the care of a doctor who had arrived from Grand Island and who had opinions about Norwegian women who refused to rest. Ragna had opinions about doctors who confused resting with waiting to die. But she was too weak to walk to the draw, and for the first time since October, Tolliff was working without her judgment beside him. The spring flood was not dramatic, it was patient. Each day the trench widened. Each day the water crept closer to the south wall. Tolliff could see the progression by the wet marks on the bank, a dark line that moved 3 inches east on Tuesday, 2 inches on Wednesday, 4 inches on Thursday. At this rate, the trench would breach in a week. Pryor heard about it. Of course Pryor heard about it. He came to the draw on a Friday afternoon with 3 men and no wagon. He stood on the east bank and looked at the eroding trench with the expression of a man who has been waiting for confirmation that he was right all along. "The creek is taking it back, Brecca," Pryor said. "I told the committee this would happen. You cannot bury a building in a drainage course and expect the water to go around it forever." Tollef was in the trench, knee-deep in cold brown water, packing clay into the eroding curve with his bare hands. His knee was submerged. His fingers were numb. He did not look up. "When it breaches," Pryor said, "the committee will condemn the structure and you will leave, and the next man who wants to bury himself in a ditch will think twice." Tollef packed clay. The water pushed it loose. He packed again. That night, he sat in the sunk car and listened to water moving outside the walls. The sound was different from wind. Wind was hostile. It attacked. It pressed. It searched for cracks. Water was indifferent. It went where gravity told it to go, and if gravity told it to go through a buried boxcar, it would go through a buried boxcar without malice or mercy. He needed Ragna. He did not have Ragna. He had to think the way Ragna thought. What would she see? She would see the curve. The trench turned too sharply at the east bank, and the outside of a curve is where water cuts fastest. A straighter path would spread the erosion over a longer line, but he could not straighten the trench without moving it farther from the sunk car, which would require digging a new channel through root-dense sod. No, Ragna would not move the trench. She would move the water. A relief notch. The same principle as the air notch inside the car, a controlled opening that redirected force before it built to a destructive level. If he cut a shallow notch in the upstream bank above the trench's sharpest curve, the overflow would split before it reached the erosion point. Half the water would follow the trench. Half would spill over the bank and rejoin the draw below the mound. The erosion would slow because the volume at the curve would drop by half. Tollef dug the notch the next morning, in the rain, while Lute Harwick braced the sunk car's door from inside, and Beret Solheim held a lantern in the gray dawn because the clouds were so thick that morning looked like dusk. He cut an 18-inch notch in the upstream bank with the sod knife, Ragna's sod knife, the one she had left in his keeping, angling the cut so the overflow would sheet across the bank top instead of channeling into a new erosive course. The water split. The trench held. The erosion at the curve slowed from inches per day to nothing. By the time the spring flood peaked 3 days later, the diversion system was handling the flow the way Ragna had designed it to handle the flow, not by fighting the water, but by giving the water a path that did not include the sunk car. Pryor came back. He looked at the relief notch. He looked at the stable trench. He said nothing and walked back to town. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. What Tollef learned in one buried room is about to spread beyond him. The spring crisis proved something that the winter crisis had not. Winter had tested the sunk car against cold and wind, the threats everyone expected. Spring tested it against water, the threat Ragna had warned about from the first day, when she had crouched beside the west bank and said, "This part will drown you." The method was not just about warmth, it was about reading land, reading water, reading the ground beneath your feet and the sky above your head, and building not for the emergency you imagined, but for the one that came. Tollef stood in the draw after the flood water receded and looked at the mound. It was scarred, mud streaks on the sod, erosion lines on the bank, a dark watermark on the south wall that showed where the creek had risen. But the door opened. The floor was dry. The stove lit on the first match. He thought about Ragna. He thought about what she would say if she could see the relief notch. He thought she would press her thumb into the bank and check the clay and say, "Better." He would have given anything to hear her say it. Ragna Moen died on April 22nd, 1888. She died in Beret Solheim's boarding room, in a bed that faced a window she had insisted be left open 3 inches because she could not sleep in a sealed room. The lung infection had deepened through March and into April despite the doctor's treatments, and in the last week she had stopped arguing with the doctor and started telling Beret things, practical things, quiet things, the kind of things a woman says when she is organizing a departure. She told Beret where the grass seed was, a small linen bag in the soddy cupboard, saved from a patch of dense root prairie that had been plowed under. She told Beret to give Tolef the sod knife, which was already at the draw. She told Beret that the upstream trench would need recutting every spring, because spring runoff always found the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance changed every year. Winter tests warmth, she said. Spring tests pride. If he thinks the trench is finished, the trench will take his floor. She died in the early morning. Beret was beside her. The window was open 3 inches. The air that moved through the room was spring air, wet, cool, carrying the smell of turned earth and new grass, the smell of a prairie deciding to live again. Tolef did not attend a funeral because Ragna had not wanted one. He stood in the draw beside the sunk car and held the sod knife in both hands and looked at the mound she had helped him build. The sod on the south wall was greening, new growth pushing through the old courses, roots deepening, binding the wall tighter. She had known this would happen. She had laid the bricks grass side down so that the roots would grow into each other, so that the wall would become stronger with each season instead of weaker. She had built a thing that grew. He drove the sod knife into the east bank beside the trench and left it there, handle up, blade in clay, the way she had left it in her chopping block the first time he came to her door. It stayed there for years. Rain rusted the blade, sun bleached the handle, but the clay held it the way clay holds everything, slowly, completely, without letting go. The handbill was Beret's idea. She wrote it on a single sheet of foolscap in handwriting neat enough to be mistaken for typeset, and she titled it 6 Things a Buried Room Must Have Before a Family Sleeps Inside. The 6 things were a drainage trench uphill of the structure, a sealed stovepipe collar with a clay buffer 4 inches thick, a fresh air notch with a sliding cover, interior bracing under any earth-loaded roof, grass side-down sod courses with staggered seams, and gray clay, not sand, not brown clay, in every seam that touched water. She did not credit Tolef by name. She did not credit Ragna by name. She wrote the 6 rules as if they were facts that existed independent of the people who had learned them, because facts travel farther than stories, and a Swedish farmer reading the handbill in a land office did not need to know who Tolef Brecke was. He needed to know that sand does not seal. Beret printed 30 copies by hand. It took her 2 weeks. She gave 10 to the land office. She gave 10 to the general store. She gave 5 to the church. She kept 5 for the families who came to her boarding house asking about the buried room near Broken Bow, the one the children had survived in, the one the county had tried to condemn, the one that used less fuel than a campfire. Tolef saw the handbill for the first time when a farmer named Peter Grindheim showed up at the draw carrying a copy and asking if Tolef could walk his property and tell him where to dig. Grindheim was Norwegian, 40, recently arrived from a failed homestead in Dakota Territory. He had a wife, 3 children, a wagon with a cracked axle, and 60 acres of unbroken prairie with no timber, no well, and no structure. He had heard about the sunk car from a freight driver who had heard about it from Lute Harwick, who had heard about it from the inside of a blizzard. The story had traveled the way stories travel on the plains, compressed, distorted, and essentially true. I do not have a boxcar, Grindheim said. I have a wagon. A wagon is not a boxcar, Tolef said. A wagon has walls and a roof. Tolef looked at the man's hands. They were farmer's hands, broad, cracked, capable. His children stood behind the wagon, watching. The youngest was perhaps 4. Tolef thought about what 4 looked like in a Nebraska winter without shelter, and the thought moved something in him that was not pity. It was recognition. He had been Grindheim 4 months ago, standing in a creek bed with nothing. Show me your property, Tolef said. They walked Grindheim's 60 acres that afternoon. The property had no draw, no ravine, no natural depression to shelter a structure. But it had a north-facing slope, a gentle rise that caught the full force of every winter wind. Tolef stood on the slope and felt the wind, and he thought about what Ragna would see. She would not bury the wagon. She would bank the slope. Tolef showed Grindheim how to cut into the north side of the slope and set the wagon against the excavated bank, wheels removed, bed flush to the ground. Then pack sod and clay against the north, east, and west faces, leaving only the south face exposed to sun and entry. The bank would block the wind. The earth would hold warmth. The wagon bed would serve as floor and frame. It was not a sunk car. It was not a soddy. It was something in between, a half-buried shelter that used the land instead of fighting it. Grindheim's wife, Christy, watched from the wagon seat while Tolef marked the excavation with stakes. When he finished, she said, "Will it hold children?" Tolef said, "It held children in January." Christy climbed down from the wagon and picked up a spade. The teaching had to stay active. Tolef learned this from Beret, who told him that people do not remember what they are told. They remember what they do. So when a skeptical German-Russian farmer named Lenz came to the draw and said he did not believe that a buried room could stay dry, Tolef did not argue. He handed Lenz a candle and told him to hold it near the south wall seam at knee height. The flame burned straight, no flicker, no lean. Lenz moved the candle along the seam, 2 feet, 4 feet, 6 feet. The flame did not move. Then Tolef took Lenz to Lute Harwick's soddy and told him to hold the candle near the north wall, where Lute had banked the earth but had not yet sealed the base course. The flame leaned sideways, not dramatically, a tilt, a flicker, a small confession from the wall that air was passing where air should not pass. Lenz said, "Where is the clay?" Tolef handed him a bucket. The candle test became the standard demonstration. Tolef used it with every visitor who doubted, and the visitors who doubted were the ones most likely to build correctly because doubt made them careful. The ones who believed too easily were the ones who skipped the drainage trench or used sand instead of clay. And those were the ones whose shelters leaked or smoked or filled with spring water. Belief without understanding was more dangerous than doubt. Ragna had known this. She had never told Tolef his work was good until she had pressed her thumb into every seam. The thumb test was doubt made physical. A woman's hand asking the wall whether it would hold and accepting no answer but the wall's own. By June of 1888, Pryor had changed strategies. He could not stop the method from spreading. The handbill was in the land office. Vale's report was in the county file. Lute was banking walls. Grindheim was digging into a slope. A family near the river had packed earth around a log pen so thick that the structure looked like a grass-covered mound from 50 yards. The idea was loose, and ideas do not have salvage claims. So Pryor tried to own it. He appeared at the draw one morning in a new coat, in a manner that was neither hostile nor friendly but commercial. He carried a rolled paper under his arm and a proposal on his tongue. "Brecka," he said, "I have underestimated your work." I will say that plainly. The buried shelter concept has value, and I believe it could be developed into a product that benefits the county. Tolliff was cutting a replacement crib post from a salvaged tie. He did not stop. I propose a partnership, Pryor said. I have capital, contacts with the railroad, and access to materials. You have the design knowledge. Together, we could offer licensed storm cellars, properly engineered, properly sited, built by qualified men, to families throughout the county. For a reasonable fee. The handbill is free, Tolliff said. The handbill is 6 rules on a piece of paper. It does not include site assessment, drainage engineering, materials, or labor. Families who follow the handbill without guidance will make mistakes. Some of those mistakes will be dangerous. Pryor unrolled his paper. It was a sketch, crude but recognizable, of a buried shelter with Pryor patent shelter written across the top in pencil. If we control the process, we control the quality. If we control the quality, no one dies. It was the most reasonable thing Pryor had ever said to him. It was also a trap, and Tolliff knew it was a trap because Pryor had used the word control twice in 3 sentences. No, Tolliff said. Pryor's face did not change. You are making a mistake. Without quality control, someone will build a bad shelter, and someone will die in it, and the county will blame you. The county can blame me. The method is not mine to sell. It is Ragnar Mohn's clay and Anson Vale's crib posts and Lute Harwick's oxen and Beret Solheim's handwriting. If you want to sell storm cellars, Pryor, sell them, but do not put my name on a fee and call it a partnership. Pryor rolled his paper. You will regret this, he said. He left without the escalation that Tolliff expected. That worried Tolliff more than the threat. The regret came in November. Pryor built his first Pryor patent shelter on a lot near the Broken Bow Town Square. It was a showy thing, half buried, earth banked on 3 sides, with a plank door and a painted sign. He charged $12 for inspection and approval, which was more than Tolliff had owned the day the railroad dismissed him. 2 families paid. Pryor built their shelters in October, working fast, cutting corners where the corners were invisible. He skipped the drainage trench on one. He set the stovepipe too low on the other. The first shelter leaked during a November rain, not catastrophically, but enough that the family inside woke to wet bedding and a seeping floor. Pryor blamed the rain. The family blamed the $12. The second shelter smoked. The stovepipe, set too low in the wall, did not draw properly because the heat had to push smoke downward before it could rise to the pipe entrance. The family opened the door to clear the room, which let cold air in, which fought the stove for oxygen, which made the smoking worse. They spent 3 nights with the door cracked open before they gave up and moved back to their plank shack. Word traveled. Pryor's shelters did not work because Pryor had not built them the way Tolliff had built the sunk car. He had built them the way a man builds who understands the shape of a thing, but not the reason for the shape. The drainage trench was not decoration. It was the difference between a dry floor and a flooded room. The stovepipe angle was not preference. It was the difference between a drawing flue and a smoking coffin. The air notch was not optional. It was the difference between breathing and not breathing. Pryor had seen the finished product and copied the outline while ignoring the principles underneath, the way a man might copy a letter in a language he does not read. The shape's correct, the meaning absent. The failure that finished Pryor was public. In December of 1888, he organized a demonstration of his patent shelter for potential buyers. He had rebuilt the leaking shelter with a proper trench, copying, at last, from Beret's handbill, but he had not fixed the stovepipe on the second shelter, because relocating it meant tearing out the wall section and repacking, which cost more than Pryor was willing to spend. The demonstration was on a Saturday. 8 men and 3 women came to inspect. Pryor lit the stove. The shelter filled with smoke in 4 minutes. Pryor opened the door. Cold air rushed in. The stove drew briefly, then smoked again as the cross draft from the open door disrupted the air pattern. Pryor closed the door. The smoke thickened. People coughed. One woman left, then another, then the men, filing out one by one, pulling coat collars over their faces. Tolef was there. He had not come to gloat. He had come because Beret told him that if Pryor's demonstration failed and someone got hurt, the county would condemn all buried shelters, not just Pryor's. So Tolef came to watch, and when the smoke drove people out, he stepped inside. He found the problem in 30 seconds. The stovepipe entered the wall at a downward angle. Smoke had to travel down 6 inches before it could rise into the pipe. Hot smoke rises. It will not voluntarily descend. The pipe needed to enter the wall at the level of the stove's exhaust or higher, angled upward so that the smoke's natural buoyancy carried it into the pipe without resistance. But the immediate problem was simpler. The air notch was missing. Pryor had not included one. There was no fresh air intake at floor level. The stove was consuming the room's oxygen, and without replacement air entering from below, the stove was pulling its draft from the stovepipe itself, backward, down the pipe, into the room. The shelter was suffocating itself. Tolef pulled his knife, cut a 6-inch notch in the lower south wall, and kicked a board across it as a temporary slide. Cold air entered at floor level. The stove's draw reversed. Smoke climbed the pipe. The room cleared in 2 minutes. He did not say anything to Pryor. He walked out. Pryor stood in the dooryard of his failed demonstration, smoke still drifting from the open door behind him, 8 potential buyers walking back to their wagons, and he said the words that Tolef had never expected to hear from him. "Put Brecca's drain in it," Pryor said to a man who had lingered. "And the widow's air board." The widow's air board, Ragna's air notch. Pryor had not used Tolef's name with credit before. He had certainly never used Ragna's, but standing in the wreckage of his own shortcut, he gave them both what the handbill had not, their names attached to the things they had built. It was not an apology. Pryor was not capable of apology the way a fence post is not capable of bending, but it was acknowledgement, delivered in the only language Pryor understood, the language of a man who has tried to sell something that does not work and who now knows what is missing. Beret and Tolef were married in the spring of 1890. The courtship had happened so slowly that neither of them could have named the day it began. It happened over diagrams. It happened over arguments about whether the handbill needed a 7th rule. It happened over the winter of 1889, when Beret moved her schoolroom meetings to the sunk car, because the school's stove could not keep the room warm, and the sunk car could, and Tolef sat in the back of his own home while Beret taught children to read, and he listened to her voice the way he listened to the wind, not for the words, but for the direction. She asked him once why he had never explained his method to anyone before the storm. He said he had not thought anyone would listen. She said, "That is not the reason." He said he did not know the other reason. She said, "You were afraid that explaining it would prove you did not understand it yourself, that the words would not match what your hands knew." He did not answer, which was his way of saying she was right. They married at the church in Broken Bow. Lute Harwick lent the wagon. Vale signed the register as witness, in the same handwriting he used for road inspection reports. The ceremony was short. The dinner afterward was long. Someone had brought fiddle. Someone else had brought applejack. Tolef danced on his bad knee because Beret told him that a man who could dig through 4 feet of snow with a stove lid could certainly survive a waltz. Their first child was born in 1891 in the sunk car, delivered by a midwife who had learned from Ragna. Their second was born in 1893. By then, the sunk car had a vestibule, the entry passage Vale had recommended, and a second room built by extending the sod walls beyond the boxcar's original length and roofing the extension with poles and sod. It was not a boxcar anymore. It was a house that had started as a boxcar, the way a tree starts as a seed and forgets the shell. The years compressed. Tolliff took seasonal work for the railroad again, not on the tie gang, but as a station hand at Broken Bow, repairing platform boards and oiling switches, work his knee could tolerate. He refused permanent assignment because permanent meant transfer, and transfer meant leaving the draw. Beret kept the notebook. She updated the handbill twice. Once to add a seventh rule about spring trench maintenance, once to add a diagram that Tolliff drew on the floor in charcoal and she copied onto paper with ink. By 1892, 8 families around the draw had some version of a banked shelter. Not all were boxcars. Most were not. One was a wagon bed set into a hillside. One was a half dugout with a sod-packed timber front. One was a conventional soddy with 3-foot earth banks packed against the north and west walls. Lute's design, copied from his own north wall and improved with a diversion trench Tolliff had helped him cut. The shapes varied. The principles were the same. Block the wind, hold the earth close, seal every seam, give the room air to breathe, and never trust a drainage course just because it is dry today. The principles were Ragnar's. The application was Tolliff's. The words were Beret's. The proof was the storm. Tolliff never became rich. He never intended to. He worked with his hands, lived in the draw, raised children who knew how to read clay by color and check a seam with their thumb. Beret's handbill traveled farther than either of them tracked. Copies passed hand to hand, creased at the folds, stained with coffee and axle grease, and the fingerprints of people who needed what was written on them. The sunk car remained. It changed over the decades. A new door in 1900, a plank floor over the buckled original in 1903. The crib posts replaced when the oak softened, but the bones were the same. The boxcar ribs, the sod walls, the stovepipe collar packed with clay, the fresh air notch with its sliding board. Children dared each other to go inside, not because it was dangerous, but because it was old and dark and had the gravity of a place where something important had happened, even if the children could not say what. Tolliff died in 1917 after a quiet illness. He was 66. Ragnar's sod knife still hung beside the door. The blade rusted brown, the handle sun-bleached to the color of old bone. Beret kept it there after his death because removing it would have been like removing a wall. The last thing he built was a door runner, a strip of salvaged iron bent to fit the track, to replace the one that had worn smooth from 30 years of opening and closing. A child from Greendheim's family, the youngest, now grown, now farming his own parcel, watched him work and asked if the structure had really been a train car once. Tolliff fit the runner into the track and slid the door to test it. The door moved without sound. "It still is," he said. "It just stopped moving." By the mid-1890s, families near Broken Bow had copied pieces of what Tolliff and Ragnar had built. Not buried boxcars, banked north walls, sod-packed storm rooms, better root cellars, safer stove vents. The spread was traceable in a single object. Beret's hand-copied plan, creased at the folds, passed from a Norwegian widow east of the draw to a Swedish carpenter near the river to a German-Russian family building their first winter room on the open prairie. Each copy was slightly different. Each copy carried the same 6 rules. Each copy smelled like the hands that had held it. Tolliff and Beret lived near the draw into old age. The sunk car outlasted the town's memory of what it had been. First a winter room, then a root cellar, then a storm shelter, then a curiosity with a railcar door that children touched for luck. Ragna's sod knife hung beside that door for 40 years. Tolef died in 1917, with the draw quiet outside and the thermometer hook still nailed to the boxcar rib, empty now, the glass long broken but the nail holding as nails hold, driven once, driven deep, and unwilling to come loose. The town had called it a wooden grave. Anson Vale had stood in this room and called it a coffin with a door. On January 12th, 1888, while the wind killed cattle standing in the open and a hired boy lost the use of his hands 50 yards from shelter, the temperature inside the sunk car held at 60 degrees on a fire, no bigger than a hatful of willow twigs, and 5 people breathed warm air in a buried room that the prairie could not find. The grassed-over roof is still there, or something like it, settled deeper into the draw. The sod courses long since merged with the earth they came from. Wind runs across the draw and never finds the wall. Snow falls on the mound and melts from beneath, warmed by ground that remembers what Ragna Moen taught it. Some things vanish because they are buried. Some vanish because they have learned how to endure.